Thanks very much, Peter, and thank you to the Don Dunstan Foundation for the invitation to be here today. I too would like to acknowledge that we're meeting to reflect on homelessness on land that always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I'd like to pay my deepest respects to the Kaurna people, to elders past and present, and I'd like to pay tribute, particularly at this juncture in our nation's history. I'd like to pay tribute to their spirit of collective dreaming, collective resistance and collective hope, because by Christ we need it now. I'm going to begin with a story. When David put up his the baby photos of his daughter, I went all gooey inside, of course, as many, I think David did too, and many of you also. When our children, we have two children, and one of our youngest one actually just turned 21 yesterday. I know you find that hard to believe because I look too young, but when they were quite young, my partner and I always used to read to them in the evenings, or we'd get them to read to us when they were able to read. And I remember on one occasion, our son, he said to me, we were lying next to each other on his bed, and he said, "Papa, I don't want to read to you tonight, and I don't want you to read to me. Can we just read our books together?" And I said, "Oh, that'd be beautiful, son, let's do that." So we lay on his bed next to each other, quietly reading our books. And then after about 5-10 minutes, he turned to me and he said, "You know, Papa, I can't get to sleep at night unless I read first." And I said, "Same with me, son, same with me." And he said, "That's because," and he hates me telling this story now, it really pisses him off, so please don't put on social media that I'm telling him. He said, "That's because when I become an adult, I want to be like you." And I just went, "Oh, geez, that's what it's all about. It's so beautiful." And then there was a little pause. And then he said, "Well, not bald." And then there was another little pause. He goes, "Or fat." Now, the reason I tell this story is because my son continues to be the king of the one-liner, and my partner and I could never win an argument against him. But on this occasion, he wasn't trying to be a smart-ass. He was actually stating the bleeding obvious because he was well aware of my intellectual limitations, and he needed to spell out the fact that his desire for emulation was limited to a love of reading and nothing else. Everything I'm going to say to you this morning is the bleeding obvious. It's what everyone here already knows, and I make no apology for that because that's our mission, is to state the bleeding obvious. And sometimes complexity is used as an excuse for inactivity. And so we need to speak the bleeding obvious loudly and clearly and prophetically. I remember learning an important lesson some years ago from a young woman experiencing homelessness in Melbourne. Everyone was walking past her and refusing to meet her eyes. She wasn't asking for somewhere to live. She wasn't even asking for something to live on. All she was asking for was enough to buy a little bit for breakfast and a cup of coffee. But everyone kept walking past her, nothing unusual, and the angrier she got, the wider the berth they gave her. "I've been here since 5 a.m, she said to me. "I just want some coffee and something to eat." And then she said, "I didn't choose this life, you know." In this simple utterance, she summed up so much of what is wrong with the way homelessness is defined in the guts of the neoliberal nightmare. I didn't choose this life, you know. Neoliberalism is presented by its purveyors as the bringer of unmatched goodies, so many that it's impossible to choose from. Neoliberalism is pitched by its champions as the defender of freedom, especially this sacred freedom to choose from amongst all those goodies. It's sold not as a political program or as an economic policy. It's sold as the only way of being, the only way of being alive, the only way of being part of the team. And as it goes without saying, to paraphrase our Prime Minister, how good is it to be part of our team? Neoliberalism is sold, in short, as a solution to the problems it causes. It's not so much that it asks you to sell your soul because it doesn't value your soul that highly. It does something far more destructive to your humanity, more lasting and more lingering. Neoliberalism sells you a soul. The price you pay is one of religious devotion to the economy, which is code for the interests of those in whose hands lies the bulk of the concentrated wealth and hence the concentrated power. Our problem, therefore, lies in the displacement of democracy by this neoliberal notion of the economy. A notion that actually veils the concrete economic conditions that are not of our own choosing, but that are by no means inevitable. As the Italian theorist Domenico Losurdo puts it, democracy cannot be defined by extracting the fate of the excluded. Democracy in this neoliberal playbook ceases to matter except when it is invoked in the actual battle against the broadest possible social, economic, cultural, industrial and political democracy. As democracy is displaced, markets matter, profits matter, but people, except when they are of use as consumers and disposable human capital, do not matter. This means accepting the ravages of unemployment, underemployment, the housing crisis, wage stagnation, the ripping up of the social security system to such a degree that it comes to resemble a social insecurity system, the stripping of workers' rights through the smashing of unions, the selling off, the shutting down, the running down, the privatisation, corporatisation and marketisation of the public sphere. It means accepting the wisdom that cutting taxes for corporations and high wealth individuals is good for everyone, even as social expenditure is reduced and even though it is patently clear that the wealth is never going to trickle down. As political theorist Wendy Brown explains, neoliberalism is best understood as a governing rationality that disseminates market values and metrics to every sphere of life. Neoliberalism does not therefore merely privatise what was formerly publicly supported and valued. Rather, it formulates everything, everywhere, in terms of capital investment and appreciation, including and especially humans. In this house of lies, which trumpets choice whilst actually restricting choice, especially when it comes to the essentials of life, it's little wonder that the young woman experiencing homelessness should need to speak that simple truth, the simple truth that drowns out the lies told about her. I didn't choose this life, you know. If she is insecurely employed, if a chunk of her wages are systematically stolen, the dominant discourse assures her it is because this is what she has chosen. If she's locked out of the labour market and locked into unemployment, if she's locked out from the housing market and locked into homelessness, it is because this is what she has chosen. If she is eventually sucked into the vortex of incarceration, which comes with the pathologisation and criminalisation of poverty, despite the fact that, as Angela Davis reminds us, prisons do not disappear problems, prisons disappear human beings. It is because this is what she has chosen. But nobody chooses this. And nobody chooses the life that neoliberalism carves out for us, except the few to whom its untold benefits accrue. And yet, in the neoliberal narrative, she is the problem. She is the problem of her own making. The absurd proposition is that she made her own absence of a bed, and so she has to lie in it. Before we even talk about homelessness as a problem, let alone the people experiencing homelessness as the problem, we need to ask, what is a problem? The word, of course, has its origins in the ancient Greek pro-balein, to throw before. How we see a problem all boils down to who defines the problem, who throws it before us, and who it is thrown before. I think you'll agree in neoliberal discourse, homelessness is not defined by the people who know the most about it, the people experiencing homelessness. And furthermore, it is not only thrown down by people who have not experienced homelessness, it is thrown before people who have never experienced homelessness. If you keep on accumulating lies, whether or not they are intentional, about who or what the problem is, you don't end up building an equitable society in which housing is enjoyed by all as a human right instead of by some as a speculative sport. Instead, you end up building extensions on the house of lies. At best, the people experiencing homelessness are told that what they need is tough love, which supposedly lies somewhere between correction and coercion. At worst, they are told that they only have themselves to blame and that virtually any assistance will only harm their chances of getting up and standing on their own 2 feet. Witness the recent government attacks on unemployed workers in the face of a desperately needed increase to New Start. Witness also the recent comments of Assistant Minister Howarth, who said on homelessness, I want to put a positive spin on it as well, and not just say Australia is in a housing crisis when it affects a very, very small percentage of the population. When you define a problem, you also get to define its solution based on how you define its parameters. The Minister then said some interesting things about how he defined the problem. He said, there are a number of areas and I'll be focusing on all of them, but I think people on the street is important because that's what Australians see if they're in a capital city. They can see people on the street and they want something done about it. It's a common trope that sees homelessness in terms of its visibility and the discomfort that people on the street cause for Australians, the us he seems to be talking to. In other words, we are being subjected to the problematic spectacle of homelessness. People experiencing homelessness are themselves defined as our problem. The solution, according to this discourse, lies not in addressing the causes of homelessness, and certainly not in providing the socio-political space for the people experiencing homelessness to talk about what the real problem is. Rather than the solution lies in lessening its visibility, clearing the streets of the people who are made to feel residual and removable, because they have, according to this rationality, chosen a terrible life. What Australia needs in this ideological fantasy is not the provision of housing, but the consignment of the condemned to the house of lies. The great poet and theorist Audre Lorde reminds us that there is no such thing as a single-issue struggle because we do not live single-issue lives. Our battles are inseparable, and yet just as unity in diversity is the greatest weapon of the oppressed and their allies, division through demonisation is the most highly effective weapon of the oppressor. Homelessness is a symptom of the deep inequality we appear to be growing accustomed to. You can get used to anything, but the more we get used to inequality, the more divided we become, and the more we lose of our collective soul, and the more we lose of our public space, which the champions of inequality loathe so much because to them it reeks of democracy. The very fact that homelessness is hived off as if it were a separate category of human existence, as if it were outside the norms of market attachment, is testimony to the success of this tactic. Of course, it's necessary to study and analyse the concrete conditions, but these conditions are manifold and profoundly interconnected, and while they intersect in unique ways in every personal narrative, it's easy to fall into the trap set by the dominant discourse when we attribute these conditions to the person experiencing them, because they seem to embody all the economic and social insecurity we fear, all the trauma that terrifies us as it touches us or dances around us. For yes, homelessness, of course, is a trauma. It is, as per the original meaning of the word, a wound. And we can only, as in John Burge's beautiful formulation, speak to the immediate wound when we understand it not just as a personal wound, but as a social wound. Or, as in the revolutionary insight of the feminist movement, when we accept that the personal is political. Homelessness does not occur in a socio-political vacuum. It occurs against the triple backdrop of colonisation, patriarchy and neoliberalism. If we are to speak to the social wound of homelessness, we must doggedly resist its fictitious separation from these cumulative trajectories. Homelessness is not an indicator of bad personal choices leading to the personal tragedy of poverty. Homelessness is an indicator of bad political choices leading to the manufacture of inequality. As the beautiful Irish proverb reminds us, it is in the shelter of each other that the people live. If any of us is without shelter, it is because the rest of us, through our political choices as a society, have failed them. Thinking critically about the causes of homelessness and inequality is crucial, but acting collectively to build the kind of society where we really are a shelter to each other, this is the key to making a concrete difference. And this is not a gesture of charity. It is an act of justice. I'd like to conclude with the beautiful words of Auntie Lilla Watson and a group of First Nations activists in Queensland in the 1970s. If you have come to help me, they said, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together.